So in the next unit, we're going to talk a little bit more about animals, animal diversity, animal evolution, and I want to start by talking a little bit about animal form and function, because we're going to be looking at lots of different kinds of animals, and we're going to be comparing their structures and functions. And we're going to do a bit of anatomy and physiology in this class. Anatomy is form, right, the structure, and physiology is the function that you find a structure performing. And form and function tend to go together, right? So the form or structure of this ear on this desert hare is very big, very thin, full of blood vessels, and that allows them to regulate heat, to dissipate heat in the hot desert sun, because there's a lot of surface area that allows blood to make contact with the surface. I know it also looks like they hear very well, and they may, but it seems that these are for temperature control. So function and form are very tied together, and all of these are influenced by physical laws, right? We all have to deal with gravity, right? And we all have to deal with UV light, right? And whatever happens to be in our environment, right? We have to deal with the laws of diffusion and movement and heat exchange, things like that. As animals get bigger, their skeletons have to be proportionally larger to support bigger mass. And you also see a lot of convergent evolution, organisms that tend to evolve similar functions, similar structures, I should say, when they have to perform a similar function. So for instance, a seal, which is a mammal, and a penguin, which is a bird, and a tuna, which is a fish, are all very different animals, right? With different evolutionary histories, and they haven't shared a common ancestor for quite some time. But you can see that the fins and the shape and the coloration are all very similar because they are in a similar environment, so they show convergent evolution. They perform similar functions, right? Swimming through water, which is a supportive medium. All organisms have to perform exchange functions. And this means that you have to bring in nutrients, things that you can use as building blocks to make proteins, right? Add fuel that you can burn to make energy, and you have to get rid of metabolic wastes that you produce that could be harmful to you. And you have to do this all across the surface, right? Things can't just teleport from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. They have to come across the surface of the cell. And so the surface area that you have dictates the amount of exchange you can do. And as you get bigger as a cell, your volume gets larger at a cubed rate, but your surface area only gets larger at a square rate. And so as you get larger, the ratio of surface area to volume actually goes down. So there's a limit as to how large cells can be and still exchange sufficiently with their environment. Similarly, if you're a multicellular organism and you're thick, right? If you're a single cell layer thick, then it's fine. Your cells can just exchange with the environment on their own. Even if you're a couple of cell layers thick, right? You can exchange with your environment on each side. But if you're me, I am, this is more than a single cell layer thick, right? And so how do the cells on the inside get access to energy and get rid of their wastes? Well, a lot of animals have to deal with this kind of situation. Some animals do it by remaining relatively small, having body walls that are only 2 cells thick, and having sort of a sac-like body plan. So let's look at a picture here. So our amoeba is having no trouble at all with exchange, but our hydra here, is a little bit bigger. These are still pretty small, but they're much bigger than a microscopic amoeba cell, and they are only 2 cell layers thick, and they have a mouth, sort of, right, an opening that allows food to come into the middle, this gastrovascular cavity, and that allows them to have exchange here in terms of fuel and building blocks. And they can exchange gases, right, oxygen and CO2, on both ends. This pore in the middle, this opening, is called your gastrovascular cavity. Gastrovascular because it's for food, gastro, this is where they digest stuff, but also vascular, in that they can kind of mush the nutrients all up and down through here, and they can just diffuse into the cells on the inner side. Another way that you can increase your surface area and decrease the amount of cells that are stuck in the middle of you is to be flat, right? So tapeworms are very, very flat, and the distance between their cells and the environment is minimized, and there's a lot of surface area in those flat tapeworms. But larger, more complex organisms like us, we have to have specialized organs for exchange that have folding to give them a huge amount of surface area relative to their volume. So here's an example of a generic animal body, right, that has special organ for gas exchange, right? We would call this lungs if this were, us. And you bring in air from the environment, you have a very folded organ that has tons of surface area and can exchange with your circulatory system. And your circulatory system then moves that gas, right, that oxygen, from your specialized organ for exchange all the way through your body so that you can spread that oxygen around and all of your cells can get it, even if they're thick right in the middle of your body. You also have to have then, if you have a circulatory system, blood and vessels and some sort of a pump to move that blood around. We also have another specialized organ with lots of surface area to digest and absorb food from the outside environment. We call this your digestive system, and we have lots of surface area so that food can be transported into the circulatory system, which again, just like with oxygen, transports it all around the body of an animal so that all of those many cells on the inside of your body can gather those nutrients by diffusion. And we have another organ for wastes, an excretory system, right? So in us, this would be our kidneys. You have lots of surface area where all that nitrogenous waste, stuff like urea, can leave, right? We also send gaseous wastes out your respiratory system. CO2 is a waste product, and we send that out of our lungs, right where we bring oxygen in. So you have to have these specialized organs with lots of surface area, and you have to have a circulatory system of some sort to move those nutrients and beneficial gases and wastes around to the particular organ where they need to go. All of your cells are hanging out in fluid, right, in some sort of fluid. And in vertebrates, we call that space between the cells that's full of fluid, we call that interstitial space with interstitial fluid, and that allows stuff to diffuse in and out of cells, and then it'll diffuse between the interstitial fluid and the blood, right, back and forth. And these complex body plans can allow animals to get much, much larger than they would otherwise be able to be, and they can maintain a relatively stable internal environment even if the external environment is a little bit more variable. Now, as you would have discussed in Bio 131, there are hierarchical levels of organization in terms of life, and the simplest level of organization that is alive is called a cell. But if you take cells that are similar in their structure and their function, and you put them together and they work together for a particular function, we call those tissues. And we'll talk about tissues here in a moment. If you take several different kinds of tissue and you put them together into a single unit that performs a function, right, we call that an organ. Right? So you have epithelial tissue that lines the inside of your heart, muscle tissue that makes it move, connective tissue that wraps it all together and holds it to what's nearby, a nervous tissue that stimulates it. Right? That's an organ. And organ systems are organs that work together to form a particular function. So your heart, your blood vessels are all organs, right? All of those work together to form your cardiovascular system. Sometimes organs can work with more than one system. And here's a broad look at these systems that you'll find in mammals, for instance. But you'll see these kinds of systems in all kinds of animals, right? And we're going to, over the next several weeks, discuss animal diversity and evolution and phylogeny, but we're also going to discuss some comparative anatomy and physiology. We're going to look at how different animals perform these different functions, right? How their organ systems differ in terms of excretion and digestion and circulation and respiration and things like that. All animals have distinct tissues, right? Again, groups of cells that work together, they're functionally similar and they perform functions. And we call these tissues by 4 different categories: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And these are the 4 main types of tissues. There are lots of subtypes that fall under each of those 4 headings. Broadly, epithelial tissue lines things. It lines the outside of the body, right? Your skin, the outside of your skin is made of epithelial tissue. It lines the insides of hollow organs and cavities in your body. And it contains cells that are really closely joined. They have these tight junctions that hold them together, like you talked about last semester. Like any good lining, right? You don't want it to be porous generally. You want the cells to be tight together. And there are three main types of cells that you'll find in epithelial tissue. Generally, they will be squamous, which are like squished little guys like this. Cuboidal, which, look like a cube. And if those cuboidal ones are stretched out and they're taller than they are wide, we call them columnar. And epithelial tissue will always have two words in the name. One will be simple or stratified, meaning there is one layer of epithelial cells, or more than one layer of epithelial cells, two or more, and then the shape. So simple squamous would be a single layer of squished flat cells. Stratified columnar would be multiple layers of columnar cell. And here are some common examples, right? We tend to see stratified squamous epithelium in places where you might get a lot of abrasion, right? You're going to get roughed up a little bit or rub up against things. So your mouth, where you're rubbing up against food, is stratified squamous epithelium. Because you probably are going to lose cells, right? While you're, it's what it looks like when I eat like chicken wings, right? Cells are probably going all over the place. And so you have to have multiple layers because you don't want to put a hole in your epithelium. And you want them to be small because they're cheaper that way, right? You haven't put as much energy into them. And so stratified squamous in your mouth. Simple squamous you would find in like your lungs because they're the thinnest possible layer of epithelial tissue, right? A single layer of squished thin cells, and that allows for easy diffusion of gases across this membrane, right? Simple columnar is a little thicker. It's a single layer of cells that are larger, and larger cells can produce more stuff like mucus, things like that. And they give you a lot more say over what gets absorbed across and what does not, what stays in the digestive tract and gets excreted out. These are similar pseudostratified columnar epithelium, but they tend to be full of mucus cells. And so you find them along your respiratory tract. They are what make the mucus that traps dust and ends up making snot, things like that. Cuboidal epithelium you find in kidneys and some other places. Those are important. Also a lot of glands. They secrete things. They help produce your urine. This is an example of stratified squamous epithelium. So you can see that this is stratified because it's many cell layers thick, right, rather than just a single cell layer. And all epithelial layers have a basal surface, which is closer to the connective tissue down here that attaches it to whatever it's attached to, and an apical surface, which in the case of your skin, right, is toward the outside. In the case of a tube, it would be toward the middle, the lumen of the tube, right? If it's a hose, it's facing where the water is flowing. That's your apical surface. And I know that down here, these cells sort of look like cubes, like cuboidal, but you name a stratified epithelial layer based on the shape of the cells at the apical surface, and these are squished. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. This is kind of like what you'd find in your cheeks, for instance. Connective tissue is characterized by the fact that it has a relatively small number of cells that are not jam-packed close together like epithelial tissue. They're scattered, though, throughout a lot of extracellular matrix. An extracellular matrix is just stuff that's produced by the cell, but it ends up outside the cell. And this extracellular matrix consists of fibers, and then sort of a gooey fluid or gelatinous matrix. The fibers can be collagen, which is pretty tough. It's a little flexible, but it's pretty tough. Elastic, which is really flexible and also rebounds back to its original length. And reticular fibers, which kind of form a net-like structure. And you'll find connective tissue all over your body, packaging, holding things together, like in your tendons. Your blood is connective tissue. A lot of diverse kinds of connective tissue, which we'll talk about in the next video.